All right, welcome to this first edition of the podcast of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education, recorded in Toronto on this Thursday, the 31st day of July, 2025. Our guest today is Professor Patrice Dutil, who's a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. And Patrice is the author or editor of some dozen books of Canadian history. He's a political commentator, and he's the host of over 100 podcasts for the Champlain Society entitled Witness to Yesterday. He's a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University, as I said. He founded and for 5 years edited the Literary Review of Canada and served as president of the Champlain Society for 7 years. He is a senior fellow at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History at the University of Toronto and a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. Among his books are Ballots and Brawls, the 1867 Canadian General Election, which is what we will be focusing on today, and Prime Ministerial Power in Canada, its origins under Macdonald, Laurier, and Borden, and Macdonald at 200. New Perspectives and Legacies, which he edited with Professor Roger Hall. Patrice, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Alan, and congratulations on getting this off the ground.
Well, it's entirely appropriate that you are our first guest because you have been so helpful in the last couple of years as we've been getting the organization off the ground. And you are, I think, probably Canada's foremost expert in Sir John and Macdonald and all things related to the prime ministers. So it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and looking forward to our conversation.
Me too.
I'd like to start. One of the things that we've kind of developed as a mantra almost is that the idea that context matters. And that's particularly the case when writing about history and talking about it. So I'd like to take you back to the Canadian prairies in the 1880s, and the Indigenous people were having a rough time. And it's been suggested that the government's response and John A. Macdonald's response was not adequate to the problem that was faced. And I wondered, there was certainly some misery there, and I wondered if you could put that in context for us.
Absolutely. And, context is everything. It's very easy for people to say, the past is easily understood. You understand the events. You can, elaborate on the sequence of how things happened. You can maybe look at a letter or look at a speech and determine what happened. But that's a mistake. And I think that what makes history important is not simply the recollection of facts and events. It's trying to understand the context. If you don't understand what was happening at the time, if you don't understand how people interacted with their environment, you cannot understand the meaning of a letter or of a speech. And that's why history is so hard to write. That's why writing good history is so demanding, because you have to understand the background. You have to understand the context. So 1885, the summer of the 1880s, the seasons of the 1880s were very difficult, particularly in the prairies. Why? First of all, there are climactic reasons. I mean, I'm not going to read you a French history here, but let's get to the point. The climate in the West was very dry. There was not enough rain. As a result of that, the crops had a great deal of difficulty. We're talking about the 1880s here. We're not growing marquee wheat. That was invented at the Canadian Experimental Farm in Ottawa in the 1890s. The methods of growing in the arid soil of the West is becoming very difficult. It's extremely cold, Alan. For some reason, There was a major cold season, a bunch of seasons in the 1880s. That made things difficult. Now, the problem with the indigenous people, the problem that were faced by the indigenous people is that they had to grow stuff. The buffalo had disappeared. Very suddenly, through the 1870s, the buffalo disappeared. The Crees, the Assiniboine, the Blackfoot, these are the big tribes that are in the prairies, about 15,000 people all in all, lived off the buffalo. They literally lived off the meat, the hide, everything was buffalo dependent. When the buffalo is decimated, mostly by Americans, because the buffalo roams across the border, the indigenous people were forced to settle. And of course, the Canadian government also forced them to settle because they could not, the government of Canada did not want to see people, roaming around the province, around the territory, I should say, not the province. There are no provinces. And so state and circumstance combined and forced the indigenous people onto reserves. That's the context. And it was difficult. You can imagine, no, we cannot imagine how difficult it must have been for the peoples of the prairies to change their ways of life that had been in existence for 10,000 years and suddenly stop and grow. Growing stuff, farming is extremely hard. And they had to do it suddenly. They had to do it instantly. So in this context, Johnny Macdonald is elected in Ottawa, becomes prime minister in 1878, in the fall of 1878, and he doesn't do nothing. In fact, he undertakes a massive revolution in government programs, particularly focused on the indigenous people in the West. Sending farm implements, sending expert farmers, setting up model farms. Now, historians have looked at this before and these programs, and I'm convinced that the people who volunteered, well, they didn't volunteer, they were paid a stipend to go and teach the indigenous people in the West, people from Ontario, few people from the Maritimes, few people from Quebec, mostly Ontario, would have gone there and it would have been completely bowled over by the realities. This is not growing a cabbage patch in Kingston. This is dealing with the frost in Saskatchewan, what we know as Saskatchewan today. There's no central heating. This is a brutal life. And the reality is that a lot of those guys came home. After 1 or 2 years, these farmer instructions came home because they couldn't take it anymore. Like I said, the climate was brutal. The people from Canada who settled out west, again, under the encouragement of Macdonald government and the creation of the CPR that's finally working its way to the West, based on that promise, people would go out and set up homesteads. They also came home. Historians have done a great job in saying that, the programs failed. The programs had problems. But the reality is that at least, so Johnny Macdonald and his government tried. They didn't just sit there. They tried. And by and large, it worked. Many farms, in fact, did work. The model farms worked. It wasn't great. There were constant complaints. It's not difficult to imagine that there were difficulties in administering this kind of a program. There's no railways. There's no running water. There's nothing. Right. And we're expecting the government of Canada, which has no social programs, it has no social programs, to assume the responsibilities of trying to help the indigenous people settle. It is what we would call today a wicked policy problem. That's what the government of Sir Johnny Macdonald was facing. Long story short, there were failures in programs, but that doesn't take away the fact that the government was innovative, that it was trying, and most of all, that it was spending money. It was spending a lot of money. This was the biggest program spending of the Macdonald government, with the exception of public works and railways. And that's a remarkable thing. And people have forgotten that about Macdonald.
And he was criticized for not spending enough.
He was criticized the opposition was saying, what are you mad? How much money are you spending? This is insane. So, again, this is where context matters. You have to understand what could have been done, what was being done. And there's no doubt that there was an incredible amount of hardship. The indigenous people suffered immensely because they had to make this transition. There is no doubt that indigenous people starved. Some of them starved to death, but they did not starve to death as a result of Sir John A. Macdonald's government. They starved to death out of very particular circumstances.
Okay, thank you. And so you published 2 books in the past year.
Yes.
Sir John A. Macdonald and the Apocalyptic Year 1885, which was published by Sutherland House in the fall of 2024.
Yes.
And Ballots and Brawls, the 1867 Canadian General Election, published by UBC Press in early 2025.
Yes.
So how could you be so productive in such a short period of time?
It's not me. I work steadily and I work hard and I work steadily, but this is really what you call accidents of publishing. You send your manuscript in, it's accepted, and after that, it's in the hands of the publishers. Some steps go slowly, some steps go faster. And, I've got 2 books coming out in the fall of 2025. They were both sent in at different times. As long as I'm steady, after that, the publishers can do what they want. I don't have a lot of control on that.
Well, congratulations on the 1885 book. That's been very well received and has won already a number of awards. And it's an outstanding book. So anyone, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you pick that up as an insight into the kinds of challenges that Macdonald was facing, and particularly in 1 year. And so that's an interesting, to me, way to write a book or to write about Macdonald. Why did you decide to focus on 1 year, 1885?
The year keeps leaping at you. I've been doing work on Macdonald now for 15, 20 years. And you study his policies and you study his failures and his successes, and somehow 1885 keeps coming up. And it occurred to me that no book had ever focused on that. We don't really do that in Canada. I've looked at elections before, and, I published a book with David Mackenzie called Canada 1911, which was about the context again. But 1885 imposed itself because everything seemed to crush itself on Macdonald practically month after month after month. So 1885 is really a study of all sorts of phenomena. So you have, for example, the Riel revolt in the Northwest. You have the issue around the indigenous starvation, because that's an issue that's been really developed over the last few years. So, and it comes up in 1885. In 1885, Sir John A. Macdonald tabled a very important bill to expand voting rights in the country. You have the completion of the CPR. You have all sorts of things happening. You have the hanging of Riel, but you also have the first cabinet meeting being held outside of Ottawa in 1885. You have the creation of the Banff National Park in 1885, all sorts of things. And last but not least, absolutely catastrophic smallpox plague in Montreal that also happened in 1885. So all these things happened in that year. All the issues of the day seem to combine in that year, which I call apocalyptic. And really, it's a study of Sir John A. Macdonald having to deal with all these issues. Of course, I bring in the British and the Americans. It's quite a year. It's quite a year, with the exception of 1917, on which I also wrote a book with David Mackenzie. It's probably the worst year Canada ever suffered, 1885.
And the apocalyptic of the title refers to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
Yes, the 4 horsemen. So I'm playing with this, obviously. I mean, it's a device. It's a literary device to shed light on the year and to guide a little bit the thinking. The horsemen of war, the horsemen of discord, the horsemen of plague, and the horsemen of death. So I mean, it works its way through that.
Well, it's a great book, so congratulations.
Thank you.
But I'm more interested today in talking about the Ballots and Brawls book.
Yes.
And so you mentioned that you have done two election studies with Professor David McKenzie, also at TMU, on the 1911 and the 1917 elections. I guess I was curious. A long time ago, I read Donald Creighton's biography of John A. Macdonald, and I don't know if I noticed it at the time. I probably didn't, but in retrospect, when I went back and looked, he skips from July 1st, 1887, right to basically October 1st, and completely doesn't devote a word to this election. And I noticed in your bibliography, you mentioned that Richard Gwynn devotes maybe a page or so. So I guess my first question about this book is, or about the subject and your choice of subject for this is, how could they have ignored such an important election? And then why do you, and I know you've described it as one of the most significant political events in the 19th century in Canada. So please elaborate on that.
Gladly. Let me start with your second question first. Why this book? UBC Press launched a series a few years ago. Called Turning Points in Canadian Elections, Canadian Politics, and the idea was to cover those elections that had not been covered before. And so, in my discussions with the editors, Ken Cardy and Gerald Beyer, and of course the managing editor at UBC Press, Randy Schmidt, we started looking at dates. And some dates, again, that had not been covered by historians before. Some dates really imposed themselves. 1921, the book has just come out from Barbara.
That's some more.
Yes. This was an
Excellent book.
Well, yeah. A very important election because you have the rise of a third party and the ending of the two-party system. I thought that 1867 fit in that turning point mode because it was, in fact, the first election, the election that really established Canada as a democracy. And for that reason, it imposed itself. And I didn't know anything about it. Like you, I simply, it just never registered that what exactly was at stake in 1867. And I think most people assumed that there was no election, that somehow the election would have predated July 1st, 1867. So I thought this was an important topic, and I volunteered to do it. Now, you ask about Donald Creighton, who simply skipped over it. There's a method here. Donald Creighton, and you have to cast your mind back here to the 1940s. Donald Creighton was this already an eminent professor at University of Toronto, and he got access to the paper, literally to the paper documentation of the Sir John A. Macdonald collection. And I've never seen this, but people have told me that he actually, would write marginalia in these documents. But I've never seen that. They were copied afterwards because they're so fragile. The archives wisely came to the conclusion that they should be microfilmed. Donald Creighton suddenly hit a dry spot. The correspondence on which he relied to write his book, his 2-volume biography of Macdonald, suddenly goes dry. There's no correspondence. It dries from mid-July until October. There's nothing there. And if there's nothing there, then Donald Creighton doesn't go there. The same thing happened with Carolus's biography of George Brown. There's not a lot in George Brown's correspondence during that summer. And you have to assume, because these guys were, constantly corresponding, that they were just too busy. That's my conclusion. That once you start looking at the events of that summer of 1867, you realize that they were very busy. They were constantly on the move. And again, 1867, everything is manuscript, right? I mean, Macdonald had a couple of assistants, but it's all manuscript. It got confirmed to me, Alan, because Agnes Lady Agnes Macdonald, after July 1st, uh, started a diary. She on July 1st, 1867, she buys this bound volume full of blank pages, and she says, "I am now going to become a diarist. I'm living this extraordinary experience." She's the wife of the Prime Minister of Canada, and she wants to write about it. So she'll write for a couple of weeks, and she writes terribly, just absolutely awful scrawl, and then it goes dead. And then in October, she resumes, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It's been so long since I've scribbled into my diary. I really feel bad." Yeah, well, Agnes, let me tell you what the historian thinks about your neglect. You know, what detail she could have given us. And I mean, had she given us that detail, this book would have been written long before, because she had an eye for detail. The few descriptions, and I capture them in my book, the few descriptions of the characters that are around Sir John A. Macdonald in the early parts of July are vivid. And, there's even quotations. Anyway, all this to say that these guys were so busy that they weren't writing. And as a result, Donald Creighton and Careless did not look at it. And it became, that part of the story just dried up. Nobody wanted to write it. A few people wrote about it in the 1960s because it was the 100th anniversary of Confederation. But we're talking about a few theses, a few articles. That's it. So this really is the first. Sorry, lack of sources. Lack of sources, very much. Okay. That made it difficult for me too, because we have newspapers now, and a lot of newspapers are digitized. The reality is that Sir Charles Tupper, for example, also his correspondence is terrible. There's nothing in his archives of any value, and that's why Sir Charles Tupper doesn't have a really good biography, which is really unfortunate, because Sir Charles Tupper,
an interesting guy.
Well, he was a formidable guy. He was a formidable force. Anyway, all this to say that we're forced to rely on newspapers, and that's what I had to do for this book.
Okay. Well, let me ask you about the title, first of all. The main title is Ballots and Brawls. So let's look at those two words. Sure. I understand people didn't vote in 1867 the way they do now. So tell us how that was a little different back then.
Well, in 3 of the 4 provinces, let's remember that 1867, you have 4 provinces voting: Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec. It was an open ballot. The open ballot means that you will present yourself in front of the returning officer, and he will ask you, "Sir, how do you vote?" And I say "sir" because women were not allowed to vote, of course. "Sir, how do you vote?" And you raise your hand. You say, "I vote for the Liberal," or "I vote for the Conservative," or "I vote for such and such a person." You identify the person by name. So everybody knows who you are, and everybody knows how you vote. That's the ballot. That's the open ballot. Now, the exception was New Brunswick. New Brunswick had adopted the secret ballot about 10 years earlier, and that was very advanced. The Australians had done it. New Brunswick had adopted it, but nowhere else in Canada, and that would not be adopted for another 8 years. The Americans, by the way, did not adopt a secret ballot until the early 1880s. So it's important to remember that changes everything. That's an example of where the structure changes the outcome, could change the outcome, or maybe not. This is a subject for debate. But I think it took a lot of guts for people to vote, and you had to know who your friends were, and you had to know who your enemies were, and that occasioned brawls. The second part of my title, I discovered, people have written about this before, how commotions did emerge in the province of Canada. But in 1867, you have a lot of tension, and a number of people come out and denounce others, and there are fist fights in Montreal, and one election in Kamouraska in Quebec will be canceled. It'll be held, much later. So there are a lot of brawls, and there's a lot of violence because everybody knows it. Now, I capture, parish priests, condemning their parishioners for what seems to be the voting trend. Other parish priests saying, "Please stay calm, stay calm. You have to live up to the ideals of democracy. It's hilarious. Oh, it's hilarious. It's not hilarious. I mean, people took it very seriously in those days, but we just don't see that kind of thing. And the commentary is also sometimes quite violent. People would condemn each other as traitors, and particularly in the Maritimes, people in the Maritimes were very upset by this election. Many people thought it was illegitimate. They thought Confederation was illegitimate, and did not go easy on their adversaries. So it was verbal brawls, but it was also fisticuffs.
And you mentioned Catholic priests looking at the trends, which implies that the voting was not all on the same day either, was it?
No. Oh, yes, a good point. I mean, Quebec started the election because you had to return the results by September 25th. And so Quebec started its elections early. Ontario followed. New Brunswick followed. And then Nova Scotia purposely decided to hold the election on the very last day. And the notion there, because the Nova Scotia government was so anti-Confederation that they wanted to make sure that they knew the results in the rest of the country to determine how they would vote. And that ruse worked because the anti-Confederation forces, led by Joseph Howe in Nova Scotia, took all the seats except for one. So they really did dominate the discussion out east, and that had a huge impact. So yes, but to answer your question, it was literally open for 2 months. It took a while to get organized, and people had 2 days to vote. And again, talk about little quirks that make a difference. So on the first day of voting, people would announce and, line up and vote, and you would have a tally. Okay, so George Brown has X votes on Saturday, on Monday, and his adversary has X number of votes. And so on the Tuesday of the second day of voting, people knew exactly who had to turn up. So, out comes the whiskey, out comes the gin, out comes the bribes. Who knows? We don't know that. We don't know that. We know that there was a lot of money involved, but we don't have any data. So you can only speculate. But that's how you made sure. Look, you say, look, so-and-so's going to win. I know you're a liberal. You got to come out. And here's a flask.
Right. Okay, well, you mentioned that both the Liberals and the Conservatives ostensibly were pro-Confederation, at least in Ontario.
Yes.
And so what can you say about the role of how George Brown and John A. Macdonald organized their party? How did they find candidates? One thing I noticed is there seems to have been more acclamations than you would find today. So tell us a little bit about party organization and the role of Macdonald and Brown.
In both cases, the party selection process is very loose. It's very loose, and it's not controlled by the center. So the best that George Brown or Sir John A. Macdonald could do is encourage people, their friends, to present themselves and to get the word out. That, for example, Leonard Tilley in St. John, New Brunswick, is the representative of the idea of Confederation. He is going to be the conservative candidate, even though he was a liberal before. He's a conservative, and we want people to vote for him. That being said, anybody could present a nomination, and this is where things become very complicated and very hard to track. There is party discipline, but as I said, it's loose, and there are always personality differences. That's inevitable. Most ridings had only 2 candidates, but there are many ridings where there were many candidates. And it turns out that the non-liberal designated or non-conservative designated candidates took an awful lot of votes. In fact, they took the plurality of votes. In Ontario, for example, 60% of the voters expressed support not for the Conservatives or for the Liberals. So who were they voting for? And we don't know that. The reality is that we don't know that. The people who ran 3rd or 4th or 5th, were they pro-Confederation or not? I suspect that they were anti-Confederation. So I'm putting a lot of weight on that protest vote and making the argument that the election of 1867 was actually marked by a great level of dissatisfaction. In Quebec, 33% of the people voted against Confederation. New Brunswick, at least 40% voted against Confederation. On a Canada-wide scale, I calculate that 42% of voters did not vote for the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party. In other words, those two parties that were arguably clearly in favor of Confederation. So to come back to your question, so Johnny Macdonald relied on local lieutenants, and there again, you have problems. And and I go into some detail in the fights that are the most important ones, but there's no doubt that there was tension. And there's also a lot of confusion. In the Liberals, for example, were really troubled by all this and divided. George Brown in Ontario was very clear that his vote was for Confederation, and by and large in Ontario, that was the case. The people who ran for the Liberal Party were all strong Confederationists. In Quebec, however, this has become a problem. The Quebec Liberals are very divided. They don't like Confederation, but they feel as though they have no choice but to carry on. And, so you have a compromised pro-Canada Liberal Party in Quebec.
And Brown didn't really make much effort to reach out to the other provinces, did he?
No, certainly not. No, Brown will stay in the province. Will stay in Ontario. He's still running the Globe. He's a working editor. He'll run in Whitby. He'll be defeated in Whitby. Right. He has real trouble. In Quebec, he has real trouble. He's long had a reputation as somebody who was intolerant of Francophones and intolerant of Catholics, and people never forgot that. So the people who win in Quebec as Liberals win on a personal basis, not so much out of conviction for the Liberal idea. In New Brunswick, the party is gravely divided. The Liberal parties dominate New Brunswick. The Liberal Party dominates New Brunswick, and it splinters. You have a Conservative Party that emerges, and you have an anti-Confederation Liberal Party that emerges. So again, in New Brunswick, it's really confusing. And in Nova Scotia, as I said earlier, Joseph Howe, who's always been a Liberal, runs on a strong anti-Confederation basis. So, I mean, it's hard to read the results that way. But the reality is, to answer your question, that the central control was extremely weak.
Well, given what you said about the results, it's almost incredible to think of Macdonald carrying on and persisting and being successful in the end.
It is remarkable, and I think that this is where the election of 1867 really matters. Is that in the end it took place. People showed up to vote, whether they were against Confederation or whether they were for Confederation. The reality is that the election was not boycotted. It could have been boycotted. 75% of the people who were eligible to vote voted. And that exercise of democracy, I think, really cemented the legitimacy of the country, because that's what this election is about. It came about after July 1st, 1867. Macdonald had been installed as prime minister on a temporary basis by Governor General Monk on the condition that he launch an election right away, which he did. But the result of the 1867 election gave Macdonald 100 seats compared to a strong minority for the Liberals, and he was able to carry on. But Macdonald learned a lesson. In 1867, he learned that the country was very doubtful of the project of Confederation. And my argument is that it's on that fear, on that basis, that he really accelerated the process to acquire Rupert's Land, to extend an invitation to British Columbia, that he worked assiduously to convince the Maritimes to join full-heartedly the spirit of Confederation, to the point where he actually reaches out to Joseph Howe,
brings him under the tent,
makes him a minister within 18 months, makes him a minister and in his government, and how we'll be working very hard to convince the West to join Canada. So I think 1867 showed, I mean, there's a whole bunch of other factors, but 1867 showed that, this was still a fragile state, and things had to advance quickly in order to consolidate it.
Well, on that note, it's an excellent book. I heartily recommend it. It's Ballots and Brawls, the 1867 Canadian election, published by UBC Press in 2025. So thank you, Patrice, for telling us about it. In the last 2 or 3 minutes, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. First of all, what got you into being interested in history in the first place?
There's a whole bunch of factors, Alan. I think, I often say it's like a bee sting. You're stung early in your life, and you discover that there's another world out there, a past world, and you're curious about it. For me, I was a big sports fan as a boy. I loved baseball, and my grandparents had a collection of old newspapers, and I basically learned to go through old newspapers as a 10-year-old and make clippings of baseball stories from the 1940s and 1950s. That's how I got into it. And somehow it stuck with me. I've always been interested in the past. It happened as a very young boy, in my case, and it's been a great company to me. It's a great diversion, and I still enjoy it. 50 years later.
That's great. Well, I'd like to close with one more question, and that is, what one book might you recommend to someone who's interested in history and wants to learn a little more, or maybe someone who's new to the subject and wants to see, or that you would like to convince to see that there's a lot here to pay attention to?
You're going to laugh, but my favorite book, a book I go back to time and again, is not a Canadian history book per se. It's a book called Historians' Fallacies Towards a Logic of Historical Thought. And it was the first book written by the American historian David Hackett Fisher. It was a book published in 1970. I bought this book in 1980 when I was a young undergraduate. I think it was a used copy. And it's a book about the logic of history. It's about insisting that there be logic in how you tell a story, that the sequence of events be logical, that you understand the difference between an actor and the context. Like, we come back to context. And I had the great pleasure of meeting David Hackett Fisher about a decade ago when he was launching his book, his big biography of Samuel de Champlain. And I had him sign the book. I mean, it's funny because it was, like almost 50 years after it had been published, but he was a great joy. And I've read all his books since then, but Historians' Fallacies I keep at my elbow, and I dip into it for any reason. It's a great read. It's a laugh. In many ways, it's a laugh. But it's always an important reminder that you have to be logical, and something we all should aspire to.
Oh, that's great. I can attest that it's a great book. I read it some time ago, but I think you've inspired me to maybe read it again. So
Wonderful.
David Hackett Fisher is still alive, so it would be lovely to have him on the podcast.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, our guest today has been Patrice Dutil, professor of political science at the University of Toronto and author, most recently, of Ballots and Brawls, and before that, in 2024, of Sir John A. Macdonald and the Apocalyptic Year, 1885. Professor Dutil, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Good luck.
Thanks. Bye-bye. If you like what you heard today, subscribe to History Matters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. You can reach me or the members of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education by email at info@cihe.ca.